This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. You know, I wanted to take a bit of a wait-and-see approach about the Browns offense and the changes that they were making, because on one hand, I absolutely thought that some changes needed to be made. I thought the idea of you forcing Deshaun Watson into this system that does not suit his strengths was not a good one. I thought that the run game stuff seemed to be a little out of date. I thought there was a lot that the Browns could improve on and get better from that they weren't currently really capitalizing on the offensive side of the ball. And the more the offseason has gone on, the more changes have been made on the offensive side of the ball, the better and better I feel about everything going on that side of the ball. I understand people's initial discomfort when you make changes on the offensive side of the ball. You went 11-6. You have a 2-time coach of the year. Why are we making changes? Is this ownership? I understand the initial skepticism of it, but these changes, everything that's happened to me indicates a team that's just trying to get better. They're not in chaos. They're not about to fire somebody. They're not forcing guys to fire guys. I think that it's just they're trying to get better. And this is how they have evaluated themselves to try to get better. And I'm very, very encouraged by this. I think that the Browns can stay healthy next year with just what they have on the roster right now. They can have a top 10 offense. Now, things have to go right. You want things to click. You want guys to take steps. But I do think that all of that is in the range of possibility that you can have a top 10 offense next year with just the guys that you have. And look, I know we're going to focus on free agency a lot. We're going to focus on the draft, and those are going to be important additions that you make to this team. But don't forget that more than likely, the biggest returning player, well, the biggest players that you're going to add to this roster are going to be the players that are returning from season-ending injury, like Nick Chubb, like DeJuan Jones, like Jed Wills, like Deshaun Watson. Those are going to be massive deals. If I told you in the Browns offseason you would get a top-tier running back, a starting quarterback, and a starting right and left tackle, you would say those are big signings, right? Well, that's what the Browns are just getting back off of injury alone. All of those guys being back is going to be a massive deal to the offense. Now, the receiving room has been the most criticized room of the Browns roster this offseason. Now, I think some of that criticism is a little bit OD, to be honest with you. Like, does it need some extra juice? Sure, absolutely. I think we all could agree there. Is it a disaster as it stands now? Absolutely not. I think this wide receiver room is pretty decent, to good, honestly. I think Elijah Moore came on strong at the end of the season. Really did think he had a real strong second half of the season. I thought David Njoku was one of the best tight ends in all of the NFL. And Amari Cooper has been special in his utilization in Cleveland. Even David Bell showed promise to me. The issue that I think that they can get better at wide receiver isn't necessarily the talent, but the utilization of that talent outside of Amari Cooper is an area where I think they can improve. And we'll talk about how I feel like they're making steps in the right direction to improve that. And I know that we all want the most overpowered wide receiver room as possible. We want to feel great about that wide receiver room, but also, Deshaun should be able to make things happen, or at least the expectation should be that Deshaun should be able to make things happen with the wide receiver room that's as good as this one, right? This is not a bad wide receiver room. This is a fine wide receiver room. You shouldn't need a overpowered wide receiver room for Deshaun Watson to play well. That's why you traded for him and signed him to be a $230 million quarterback, is so that he can elevate some of those wide receivers. So I don't think that you need to have the most overpowered one, right? You shouldn't require having Amari Cooper and Devontae Adams in order for him to be good. Now, if you get it, I ain't got no problem with it, right? I'm not opposed to getting more good wide receivers, but it shouldn't require that. We shouldn't need that level of overdevelopment at the wide receiver room in order to get good to great play out of Deshaun Watson. We should be able to get that with what we have, quite honestly. And if you look at the two teams in the AFC Championship game this year, the Baltimore Ravens and the Kansas City Chiefs, you can make the argument that the Browns have a much more intriguing receiving room than both of those teams. I think I would take Amari Cooper over any wide receiver that they have. And David Njoku's not better than Travis Kelce, but the combination of David Njoku, Elijah Moore, and Amari Cooper is better than Kansas City's current wide receiver crop. And same can be said for the Baltimore Ravens. The Browns have a better group of receivers, pass catchers than they do. So yes, they could improve wide receiver, but I don't think that I'm going to lose my mind if they don't add like a giant name to the wide receiver room. That's what the money's for Deshaun. He's got to live up to that in some way. And again, you don't want it to be a disaster. You don't want him to be throwing out the Joe Schmo and limit his abilities. But you do want that room to be competent, and I think that room is competent. But that's not the only reason I'm encouraged, right? The other reason I'm encouraged is something that I feel like Jake Burns hit right on the head with this tweet. Jake Burns said, "Feels like I've been podcasting and writing about a desire for the Browns to add elements of McVay and Steichen to their offense. The evolution of RPO use with motion elements tied to both phases between Dorsey, Dickerson, Evanston, they have done just that, a potpourri of styles. They have lacked consistent inside zone process, lacked the ability to pair it with RPO schemes, also lacked useful motion in both the pass and run games. And now they have someone from each of these elements to provide insight and design and provide Kevin with more answers for attacking defenses." Now, when it comes to the structural stuff, the film breakdown stuff, the offensive coordinator-ish stuff, when it comes to Browns coverage, Jake Burns is about as good as they come. For any team, not just the Browns. For any team, he is about as good as they come. He has really good knowledge about these kind of things. He studies everybody. He is highly recommended in this space. And he has been saying for a while that he wants the offense to kind of have some of these things that you see other offenses have. And he's saying that from what he can see, and he has a very well-informed opinion, it looks like they're adding those things, that they're making those tweaks. And that's important. See, a lot of people are so used to looking at the Browns needing a new offensive coordinator in the way that the old Browns would need an offensive coordinator, which is to say that the coach is on the hot seat. He's on a lame duck year, and we need to hire an offensive coordinator. And we've never even really got to that point of dysfunction. Like, we've never had a coach that long that we got to that point of dysfunction. But this is not that. The Browns realized that they were not advancing or as advanced as other teams. They saw teams like Houston, teams like Detroit, even Seattle lap them in innovation, RPO, all of this stuff. And they decided to make changes to their staff so they're not being lapped. I think this is a good move. And it's a good move, especially given the fact that you had all the excuses in the world to not make these moves. I think that's why it came as a shock, because a lot of people would have rested on their laurels and said, no, Joe Flacco played well. We're going to run the same thing. And that would have been a huge mistake. That was the number one thing I was concerned about when Joe Flacco was having success was this success going to give us a false sense of confidence in an offense that we know needs to be changed? It did not. They were smarter than that. And I think that that's going to pay off dividends. The Browns have made some tweaks to the offense. And I know there's this narrative out there that the offensive coordinator or that Kevin Stefanski was forced to make these moves. I can tell you with a good amount of confidence, a great amount of confidence, honestly, that I think that those rumors are very much not credible. That ownership forced him to do this, or that DePodesta forced him to do this. I think that's an inaccurate description of what happened. I think a more accurate description of what happened was DePodesta, Andrew Berry, and Kevin Stefanski all had their, postseason wrap-up meeting. They discuss areas in which they feel like they have succeeded and want to double down on, and they discussed areas in which they feel like they need to be improved upon. The offense was one of those areas where they came to an agreement that it needed to be improved upon. And then they moved forward, making changes to add some of the things that they all agreed that they needed to add. And sometimes those changes means that you got to let somebody go because they don't fit the new direction that you're trying to go. This is how stuff happens in the real world. This is how improvement happens in the real world. So it going that way for a football team is not really that shocking. Now, it's not how things have gone for the Cleveland Browns. Usually we do things a little bit more dysfunctional, and I think we're projecting that onto everything that the Browns do nowadays. But I think that this was a pretty well orchestrated move by the Browns to be able to update and upgrade their offense. The Browns did not run the ball out of the gun well. They did not do a lot of RPO, and they didn't feel like they did the best job. I don't think they did the best job of utilizing wide receivers, specifically wide receivers not named Amari Cooper or David Njoku. Far too often, these other wide receivers were just relegated to running cardio, right? Donovan Peoples-Jones was running cardio. Cedric Tillman was running cardio. David Bell was running cardio. Basically, the same thing we complained about with Odell Beckham, right? Where he would be just running nines for no reason, or not no reason, but to be a decoy. Just too much of that going on where you're not utilizing some of these guys with different skill sets. We complained about this with Elijah Moore running cardio as well. I think that was something that they wanted to improve upon. I think bringing in Ken Dorsey is a huge part of that. Now, I know some people aren't a fan of Chad O'Shea, the wide receiver coach, and I don't know what Chad's specific responsibilities and if he was just doing what he was told to do by AVP or anything, but it feels like they don't think he was the problem in that wide receiver room. So we'll see what happens this year, and maybe with the new offensive coordinator, things change in that front. But one thing that I think became obvious was this strict West Coast approach that we publicly heard Alex Van Pelt and Stump Mitchell advocate for in the context of putting Deshaun Watson in it was just not a natural fit for this roster anymore and Deshaun Watson. But let's focus on that roster part, right? Because we focus so much on this move being about Deshaun Watson that I think it's kind of minimized the bigger point to me, which is it's a better fit for this offense to get more modern for everybody on this offense. The Browns weren't creative on how to get the ball to David Njoku. Like, we all acknowledge this, that they could be a lot more creative with how they use David Njoku. They could use him as a wide receiver in the red zone. They could use him, do some things with him, throwing 50-50 balls. Like, we really only seem to use David Njoku on like 5 things. And he was kind of used as a traditional tight end outside of a couple of screenplays that we called up for him. And I think that's a waste of David Njoku. The same can be said for a guy like Jordan Atkins. Maybe you get more out of him too when you change the offense up. Wide receiver wise, I think this is the biggest part, right? We're complaining a lot about wide receivers, but I think if they're in a system that better allows them to do what they do well, I think they'll be pretty damn good. And I think Elijah Moore is somebody who's going to benefit from that. Obviously, Amari Cooper's going to be fine. He's one of the better wide receivers in all the NFL. He's super consistent. He's going to be fine doing his thing. But I think Elijah Moore, maybe even Cedric Tillman, David Bell, they might be better off in a different style of offense. Well, not a different style of offense, but being utilized a little bit differently than they were. And while I think the offensive line coach, Bill Callahan, did a great job, I do think a new approach will fit this offensive line better. I think running out the gun, doing some guard tackle guard, inside zone, all those things benefit what the Browns have on their personnel because it focuses more on that interior than the tackle positions. And blocking for Deshaun Watson is a different beast than blocking for a traditional pocket passer, and maybe a different approach is necessary to kind of get that where you want it to get to, because Deshaun Watson was sacked far too often in his first 6 games back in 2022, and he was sacked far too often in 2023. So you want to make some adjustments to that. Also, you want Deshaun to make some adjustments to that. Now let's talk about why I'm encouraged from a standpoint of Deshaun Watson. Deshaun is a different quarterback than the ones that Kevin has had success with. If you look at the quarterbacks that Kevin has had success with, they're a very specific type of quarterback, right? It's Kirk Cousins, it's Jacoby Brissett, it's Joe Flacco, it's Baker Mayfield. All of those guys are primarily pocket passers. They're not read option run threats, right? So they're not direct designed run threats at all. Even Jacoby Brissett, he's definitely not a designed run threat. He runs like a 5-1. And they thrive when playing in structure, or at least they thrived while playing in structure. Baker's a little bit of a different case because I feel like he did thrive when he played in structure, but then he tried to play outside of structure in 2021, and that really hurt him a lot. But coaching guys like that, right? Guys who thrive in structure, guys who thrive getting the ball out quick, guys who thrive in timing situations and pre-processing is a different beast than Deshaun Watson. Because Deshaun does not need that much structure to be successful. We saw that in Houston. He needs flexibility to be successful. Watson is what I call a post-processor quarterback. He sees things better as they happen. Now, there's a lot of quarterbacks who play like this. Pat Mahomes is a post-processor. Joe Burrow is a post-processor. CJ Stroud, Justin Herbert, Josh Allen. There's a bunch of guys you could fit in this category, right? They're post-processors, which means they're at their best when they're allowed to process things as they happen. Now, that doesn't mean that these quarterbacks can't pre-process. I think they're fine in their pre-processing. The difference is that they have different skill sets that they bring to the table that makes it less helpful for them to rely on pre-processing as it is to rely on post-processing, right? All of those quarterbacks I mentioned can move outside the pocket and run a little bit, right? Joe Burrow, much more mobile than people give him credit for. He's very, very agile. He does most of his damage outside the pocket, throwing on the run. That's really Joe Burrow's play style there. We see it with CJ Stroud as well. Justin Herbert, very similar. And then obviously there's no questions about if Josh Allen fits that description. The reason these guys are post-processors is because they have an active variable about them that changes how defenses will cover them, right? When you can run the ball, when you are a variable as an athlete at the quarterback position, defenses adjust to that differently than if you're not. So that makes what you see what you see pre-snap less reliable than it would be for somebody who does not have those talents. So you have to rely on your post-processing ability to be able to play at a high level in the NFL. Deshaun is a post processor. I think Kevin's highly structured style was for quarterbacks who like to pre-process. And you can get a long way with quarterbacks who pre-process, right? Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, right? If you want modern examples, Brock Purdy, Kirk Cousins, all these guys, they are master pre-processors, but they don't have those variables about them that makes their pre-processing stuff a little bit less reliable than it would be if they can move outside the pocket, if a team might spy them, things like that. Like, they're not, the way that you cover those guys is not as dynamic as the way that you cover somebody who's a bit more of an athlete at the quarterback position. Now, obviously, this whole thing is a spectrum, not a binary. There's a flex to it. Some guys can be here on the post-processor spectrum. Some guys can be kind of in the middle, right? And Deshaun's a little bit closer to the middle, but he definitely leans towards being a post-processor. And I think Kevin's system was trying to make him a pre-processor. And I think there is obvious compatibility issues when you try to do that. And now that you have him hopefully being in the system and having an approach similar to a Cam Newton and a Josh Allen, I think you're going to get more out of him that way. So that's why I'm super encouraged about the Cleveland Browns. I think that this team is on a really good track. I think they're making really smart changes. And if they can stay healthy, I think the ceiling is the roof for this team. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have a better night. Peace.